Somewhere in ancient Egypt, a king got so terrified of baby boys that he ordered every single one of them thrown straight into a river. This is easily the most insane overreaction in the history of insane overreactions. And here's the wild part. One specific baby actually survived that exact river, grew up inside the very palace of the king who wanted him dead, and came back decades later to humiliate that same kingdom with blood, frogs, darkness, and an actual sea that opened up like a zipper. His name was Moses. So let's rewind and figure out exactly how a baby marked for death ends up rewriting the rules for an entire civilization. Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, was having a full-blown panic attack because the Israelites, who were technically just guests living in Egypt after a famine centuries earlier, had multiplied so fast that Pharaoh looked at the population chart and basically screamed, "They're outbreeding us, do something." So his brilliant solution was to enslave them, and when that predictably backfired, things got dark fast. Right into the middle of this chaos, a Hebrew woman named Jochebed gives birth to a baby boy and decides there is no way she's tossing her son into a river just because a paranoid king said so. So she does the next most logical thing. She builds him a tiny floating basket, waterproofs it with tar, and sets him adrift on the very river he was supposed to drown in. And guess who happens to be bathing nearby at that exact moment? Pharaoh's own daughter. She spots the basket, fishes it out, falls instantly in love with the baby, and decides to raise him as her own son right inside the palace of the very king who ordered babies like him to be killed. So Moses grows up basically living a double life, Egyptian prince by day, secretly Hebrew by blood, eating fancy palace food while his entire ethnic group is out there laying bricks under the desert sun. This works fine until Moses is a grown adult, and one day he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave. Moses, who clearly skipped every anger management class ever offered, kills the Egyptian on the spot and buries him in the sand like he's hiding evidence on a true crime show. He thinks nobody saw it, except somebody absolutely saw it. Word spreads, Pharaoh finds out, and Moses goes from palace royalty to most wanted fugitive in about 24 hours. So he flees into the desert region of Midian, where, in true desert romance fashion, he meets a priest named Jethro, marries his daughter Zipporah, and settles down as a shepherd for the next 40 years. This means the guy who's about to confront the most powerful king on earth spends 4 decades just hanging out with sheep. And honestly, that's the most relatable career gap in the entire Bible. Then one day, while tending the flock near Mount Horeb, Moses sees a bush that is on fire but somehow not burning up. Because curiosity has never once worked out badly for anyone in history, he walks over to investigate, and the bush starts talking. It's not just any voice, it's God himself, announcing that Moses has been selected for a very important and extremely terrifying job, going back to Egypt to confront Pharaoh and demand the release of the Israelites. Moses' immediate reaction is basically a list of excuses, starting with, "I'm nobody," moving on to, "What if they don't believe me?" and finishing with, "I'm not exactly a great public speaker." God responds by turning his staff into a snake just to prove a point, and also recruits his brother Aaron to do the talking, since Moses apparently has stage fright. So the two of them march into Pharaoh's palace and deliver the message, "Let my people go." Pharaoh, who has never once in his life heard the word no, laughs them out of the building and actually increases the workload on the slaves just to be petty about it. So God decides subtlety is overrated and unleashes 10 plagues on Egypt, one after another. It starts with turning the entire Nile River into blood, which ruins everyone's hydration plans immediately, followed by a frog invasion so intense you couldn't walk anywhere without stepping on one. Then gnats, then flies, then a disease that wipes out Egyptian livestock while sparing the Israelites' animals completely. Then boils breaking out on every Egyptian, then a hailstorm mixed with fire raining from the sky, then locusts eating every single plant left standing, then total darkness covering the land for 3 days straight. Through every single one of these increasingly chaotic disasters, Pharaoh keeps saying he'll let them go and then changing his mind the second the plague stops, which is basically the most stubborn negotiation tactic in recorded history, until God brings the 10th and final plague, the death of the firstborn son in every Egyptian household. But he instructs the Israelites to mark their doorframes with lamb's blood, so this plague passes over their homes entirely, which is where the holiday Passover gets its name. This final plague finally breaks Pharaoh completely. He tells the Israelites to leave immediately, like pack your bags right now, kind of immediately. So roughly 2 million people grab whatever they can carry and head out of Egypt in one of the largest mass exits in ancient history. But of course, Pharaoh changes his mind almost instantly, and he sends his entire army chasing after them, trapping the Israelites against the edge of the Red Sea with nowhere left to run, until Moses raises his staff and the sea physically splits in half, creating a dry path with walls of water on either side, and the Israelites just casually stroll through the middle of an ocean like it's a regular Tuesday. But the moment the Egyptian army tries to follow them through the same path, the walls of water collapse and the entire pursuing army is wiped out, which is easily the most dramatic plot twist in the whole story. Now, the Israelites are technically free, but stuck, wandering through a massive desert with literally zero supermarkets. So God starts providing food called manna that just appears on the ground every single morning, like the world's strangest cereal delivery, along with quail for protein and water that miraculously flows out of solid rock when Moses strikes it. After a few months of wandering, the entire nation arrives at Mount Sinai, where Moses climbs up to meet with God directly and comes back down carrying 2 stone tablets containing the 10 Commandments, which basically lay out the entire rule book for how to live, covering everything from worshiping one God to not stealing, to not murdering your neighbor over a parking spot. But here's the part that makes this story genuinely hilarious in the worst possible way. While Moses is up on the mountain receiving literal divine law, the people down below get impatient after about 40 days, melt down all their gold jewelry, and build a giant golden calf to worship instead, throwing a full-blown party around a cow statue, while the actual rulebook against worshiping idols is still being carved a few hundred feet above their heads. When Moses comes down and sees this disaster, he is, understandably, furious. He smashes the tablets on the ground and has to go back up the mountain to get a new copy because apparently nobody proofreads anything in this story. This golden calf incident becomes the opening act for what turns into 40 straight years of wandering through the wilderness, not because the journey itself takes that long, since the promised land is actually a fairly short trip away, but because the people complain so constantly about food, about water, about literally everything, that God decides this entire generation needs to learn some patience the hard way. At one point, he even sends spies into Canaan to scout the promised land, and 10 out of 12 spies come back so terrified of the giants and fortified cities living there that the entire nation has a collective breakdown and refuses to go in, which seals their fate to wander in circles for 4 decades while an entire generation slowly passes away. Through every single complaint, rebellion, and golden calf-level disaster, Moses somehow keeps leading these people, arguing with God on their behalf more than once to stop him from wiping them out entirely, climbing mountains, splitting seas, striking rocks, and basically running the most chaotic group project in human history. But here's the twist that makes this story end on a genuinely bittersweet note. After 40 years of leading these people through the desert, Moses himself is not allowed to enter the promised land due to an earlier moment where he struck a rock in frustration instead of simply speaking to it like God instructed. Instead, God brings him up to the top of Mount Nebo, shows him the entire promised land stretched out in the distance, and lets him see it with his own eyes. Then, Moses dies right there on the mountain at 120 years old, never setting foot in the land he spent his entire life trying to reach. Leadership passes to his successor Joshua, who finally leads the people across the Jordan River into Canaan, closing out one of the most dramatic, chaotic, miracle-filled, and surprisingly emotional stories in the entire Bible, proving that sometimes the person who does all the work doesn't get to enjoy the reward themselves, but their legacy still walks straight into the promised land anyway.